Hi everybody, welcome back to .NET on Azure's Beginner Series. My name is Matt Sokup, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about deploying .NET applications to containers, and of course, they're going to be going to Azure. So let's get started. First, I want to talk about some benefits of containerizing an app. So when you containerize an app, all of the components for your application, all the way down to the NuGet packages it depends on, even the runtimes, are put into a single package or a container. Well, it's called a container when you actually new it up and start running. It's an image file at first. So everything that you need to run your app is in there. So when you new up a container, so to speak, you can be assured that everything is the same. All the new instances are going to be exactly the same because the container is more or less immutable. So you can quickly spin up these new containers as well once you put them into a container runtime such as Docker. And these new instances can be deployed in many different places. Places such as Azure, which is great, or a Docker runtime on your local computer, which then enables agile development. So imagine that you're developing an application and it has two parts to it. One part is a product catalog, just serves out products back from a database. Another part might happen to be the review portion. It allows you to make reviews to the product catalog. The review portion, if you're developing that, you can get the product containers and run that on your local desktop. So you don't have to actually get everything, the full application, the full monolith, both the products and the reviews up and running. You can just get the products down, work on the reviews, and you'll be great. So now let's talk about getting containers in the cloud. Containers in the cloud enable a microservice architecture, and I kind of alluded to that just before. You can start now within your container just putting the code necessary to have exactly what you want, just real little bit. We're talking like just talk about the products or just talk about the reviews. Really concentrate on the logic for individual portions of your applications. And so what's nice about that is you can start scaling up on demand and independently. So if people are really writing a ton of reviews on your application, you can start spinning up new instances of that review component as needed, where you don't have to spin up new instances of the product component. So you're only spinning up what you need to do. And you also have portability between different environments, which is nice because if you're unit testing on your unit testing environment, as long as it runs on a Docker runtime, you can be sure it's going to run the same in production. Or when you're developing it, you can be assured if it runs on your development runtime, it's going to run on the unit testing runtime. So you have this nice portability between the different environments. Or conversely, different Azure services that run containers. You can be sure if it's running on one containerized runtime, it's going to run the same on other ones because your image files are immutable. And it gives you nice isolation from the operating system. So the container runtime, which is going to be Docker for the most part, is a virtualization runtime, and it's set off from your operating system. It's like closed off from it. So like the networking is different, and you can be sure that your application is more or less protected from what's going on in the operating system. So you have that isolation. You also have isolation from different containers happening. So let's say one container goes down. There's a bug happening in one of our review services. It hit a bug and it goes down. Well, we can spin up other review services to make up for that, so it can scale up and we can cover, so to speak, so our whole application doesn't go down. And also, our containers are separated, our reviews are separated from the products as well while we scale them up. So we have nice isolation between both the operating system and other containers on the system. And it also enables really nice continuous integration and deployment. So as you can imagine, if we're scaling up and down independently, because each container really is independent, we can then deploy those independently as well. And all of this I'm talking about really fits in nicely with a cloud-native infrastructure. So what are some Azure container services? And there's a whole bunch of things in Azure that can run containers. And the first one I want to talk about is the Azure Container Registry. You can think of this kind of sorta like NuGet, but for containers in Azure. So it's really analogous to Docker Hub. And what it does, in addition to being able to host your containers or your image files, really, what it does is that it gives you the ability to have all the Azure goodness like security added to it. So let's say we have an Azure App Service who needs to pull a container down. We can say, you know what, only App Service A has access to pull that container via managed identity. So you have all the security that you would come to expect with Azure. You can apply that to Azure Container Registry. Now, of course, I just said it before, you can run your containers on Azure App Service, which is nice. You make a change to your web service, push it out to Azure Container Registry, and then you can have a deployment also to Azure App Service right away so your website gets updated. Azure Functions, you can make a container with and have your Azure Functions run. And then Azure Container Apps, which is a relatively new Azure service, is made specifically for containers. And what's nice about Azure Container Apps, you can think of it kind of as an abstraction over Kubernetes. It gives you all of the goodness of Kubernetes, but an abstraction over the top to make it easier to use. And it's almost like a serverless offering, but for containers, where if something is not being used, it'll scale it down to 0. And you also get Dapper integration, as well as Kata event-driven architecture, Kata rules that you can apply to your containers as well. It lets you define rules that you can scale your containers right up. All put into Azure Container Apps, and you can run multiple containers on there, set networking rules with them. So it's really like a microservice in a box container service. And of course, there is Azure Kubernetes Service, which is a Kubernetes in the cloud, managed Kubernetes instance, and it lets you run your Kubernetes infrastructure in a managed way, so you don't have to run everything yourself. And the last one is Azure Container Instances. Now this is a little bit of a lighter weight container service, and what this does is allows you just to new up a container in the cloud and run it. So it's not meant for heavy-duty workloads. So if you want a heavier workload, you might put it in an app service or an Azure function if you're running some kind of web app. But if you just need it up and running to do some testing, you just want to take your container, your image file, and run it into a container and just test it or do something really lightweight with it, Azure Container Instances is a great way to do it. Now, all of these services, app service, functions, container apps, and so on, can pull from Azure Container Registry. So Container Registry is like it's like the centerpiece. You're going to push your images up there. Then the other services, when they need to new up or make sure you containerize everything and running the container, they're going to pull from the Container Registry. All right, so we're going to do a demo now. We're going to containerize our application, our web API, and we're going to push it up in the Container Registry, and then we're going to push it out to App Service. So let's take a look at how we would do that. All right, so what I'm going to do is we have our code here. We have the munsandpickles.api and the munsandpickles.web file. Now, of course, in order to do a container, you're going to need a Docker file. Visual Studio gives you a nice way to create Docker files just by right-clicking on the solution, doing add, and then Docker support. By putting the Docker support in and ask you which target operating system you want to go to, we'll pick Linux. And then after that, it actually creates a whole Docker file for you. Now, I want to point out here that munsandpickles.web has a dependency on munsandpickles.shared, which is cool. Visual Studio traversed my dependency tree, found that out, and put this into my Docker file. Now, I'm not going to get into what Docker files are and everything. I'll put a link into the show notes, which will take you to a Microsoft Learn module so you can learn more about Docker. But it's nice that we can just right-click and get everything that we needed to create an image from our code just from Visual Studio. So I want to actually create the image here. But what's going on is, you notice I'm running a Mac, but I'm showing Windows, which means I'm running a virtual machine on a Mac. And if I wanted to actually create the image, I would have to run Docker. And running Docker on a virtual machine would just really, it's not a super great idea. However, what I can do is then run Azure Cloud Shell. And I can actually let Azure Container Registry create an image for me all up in the cloud, which is super cool. So I want to show off a little bit about Azure Container Registry before we get going. And so the first thing I need to do with Cloud Shell, and this is Windows Terminal, and just want to show off, we have all the different terminals, different shells I can run within Windows Terminal. And so the first one is, that I'm going to pick, is Azure Cloud Shell, and I have to log in. So I'm going to actually do that right now. Paste in my device code, select my user account and say, yes, I am trying to log in. I should be good to go. It says I am. Picking out which tenant I want to log into. And then what's going to do is going to actually create a Cloud Shell for me. So even though my Azure Cloud Shell here is local, we're actually running up in Azure. And what's nice about this is the tooling in Azure. I have access to things like the GitHub CLI. I have access to Docker and so on. So it's like a full-blown terminal system. All right, I see that everything is connected. And right here, GitHub CLI-help. And there it is. I can see all the help for GitHub. I can do a .NET-help. And .NET is installed up in Azure as well. So I have everything installed that I need in order to build an image from my code. So let's check out what I have in my home file, home directory. And right now I don't have anything, which means I need to go grab it from GitHub, our sample code. So I'm going to go the GitHub CLI, copy the clone directory or instructions, and then grab that. So it clones in and I have everything down. So the next step, what I want to do here is go into my beginner.net on Azure directory and then to the appropriate samples directory. And all right, now I can see where I am. I have all the Munts and Pickles solutions, project files, and so on. So it's from here that I'm going to build the image file. All right, so the next thing I wanted to do then is show you the Azure Container Registry that I already created within Azure. So I've called it Munts and Pickles ACR. And so what this does is that it just gives me, well, this is just a container registry, and it's right now blank. So let me actually go down and zoom size just a tad, and scrolling down on the left-hand side, I can see the repositories that I would have up here. So these would actually be the image files that I have up. And as soon as it loads up, you can see that right now I have nothing here. So let's build something and push it up the Azure Container Registry. So the first thing that I would need to do then is build it. And so I can use the Azure CLI to do that. So the terminal command that I would need to use is ACR, and the Azure terminal is actually giving me a prompt to do it. I've run this before, practicing, and so it remembers the command. So I'll just tab it through, and it's ACR build --image pickles /API v1. So I'm naming my image, giving it a tag, --registry, telling the Azure Terminal CLI which ACR I want to deploy to. So it's Munts and Pickles ACR.azure.cr.io, and then which Docker file I want to use. Now, because my current directory is up a level where I can see all the project files, which is what I want to do because I want to both include the shared project and the API project together. So I want to be up a level because that's how I have my Docker file created. So I'm going to tell it to go into the muntsandpickles.api/Docker file, and then I'm running it in my current directory. Enter. And what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and build my image for me. And you can see it's got all the source code, downloading the source code, and it's going through and doing the normal build, and it's going to eventually push it up. So this is the same thing that you would get have you been trying to run Docker locally, the Docker build process. So this is actually cool. This is all running up in Azure. And once it's complete, we'll be able to actually see it in the ACR. So we're at step 9. We're actually running the .NET restore, grabbing everything from NuGet that we need, and then eventually we're running .NET build at this point. MS build is kicking off, and I have a ton of warnings in there because I'm not a great coder. Well, I don't fix my warnings. And then eventually .NET publish, copying it from the publish directory, building the image, and now we are pushing up to ACR right now. So this should be almost finished, and when it does, we'll take a peek at it. Great, finished up, and I go back into my repositories of my ACR instance in Azure, hit refresh, and I can see it's there. I'll zoom in just a tad. Pickle/API, I can see the v1 tag. So if I was building more than one image, I would tag the next one v2 or so on, so they would stay there. And I can go in it here. And actually, I can see the Docker pull command if I wanted to go and grab this image to use it in a container or containerize it and use it elsewhere, new up that container. So the first step of that is to pull it. Great. So before I actually deploy it to Azure anywhere, what I'm going to do is run it locally, but I'm going to run it locally on my Mac. We built it with Linux, so I'm going to run everything here on the Mac side of things. So the first thing I need to do here is actually I have the Azure CLI installed locally, is do an ACR login, pass it into -n for -name, and then copy over the name of the ACR, so Munts and Pickles ACR. So I'll copy that title and then paste it in. Munts and Pickles ACR. So now this will allow me to, in this terminal session, log in to the Munts and Pickles ACR Azure Container Registry. Login has been succeeded. Wonderful. So the next step then is to actually pull my container down. Back over to the portal, repositories, and what I'm going to do is just copy over what's needed, the Docker pull command. So I'll copy that to the clipboard, back to the Mac, paste that in, and then pull it. So it's pulling everything down from Azure. And it'll take just a second to grab everything. And now, if I go and view Docker Desktop in my images, you can see I have it here. But nothing's actually newed up into a container. It hasn't containerized anything yet. So that's my next step of what I want to do. And because the API web app is connecting over to an Azure SQL Server, there's a connection string that I'm using. And it's a long connection string. I don't want to actually have to type that out. So I have my Docker run command already typed out for myself, so I don't have to type that all out. And all it's saying is Docker run mapping port 80 of the internal container to 10,001, and then the connection string as an environment variable. Run that. And it says it's not able to find the Munson Pickles ACR Pickles API v1 locally. So I must have a typo in. All right, so I'm going to try to type it out by hand, and hopefully I get it. So let's clear this up. So I'm going to do docker run -p, map my ports 10,001 to 80. And then giving me my environment variable, which I happen to have copied down manually as well. Some might say anticipating this potential error. And before I put that in there, I want to make sure I get right after the port, I want to put in which my image that I want to put into a running container is. And that's going to be, let's make sure we get it typed in correctly from Docker desktop, Munson Pickles ACR, Munson Pickles ACR dot Azure CR.io, Azure CR.io, /pickles/API. All right, so I'm going to not do the tag here and see if we have any better luck. It's still not able to find the images. So let's do the image v1 for the tag. And finally, we got it going. So despite all the typos, we finally have it up and running. So when it spins up, what it's going to have to do first is wake up Azure SQL. Now I have Azure SQL as a serverless instance right now. And as you can see right at the bottom, it's saying, you know what, an error has occurred. I can't get to it. So it's pinging Azure SQL saying, hey, wake up, wake up, wake up. And then finally down here, it actually says it's got it. And then what it's going to go through then is have Entity Framework push out its initialization, and then we should be able to browse to it. Aha. What I need to do is, I kept on getting the errors for Azure SQL. That's because Azure SQL has a firewall in front of it. And what I need to do is grant my current IP access to that firewall. So I'll open up the Azure SQL instance and then grant myself my current IP access to it. All right, so my IP has access to it now. So back to the Mac. And then we can run our Docker run again. And now everything is up and running. So I should be able to browse to localhost port 10,001/products, and I can see the products being returned from the database. So we had typo issues, we had IP firewall issues, but solved those all. And here we go. On the Mac, running our container that we built on Windows, all on Linux, which is great. Containerization, portability between environments. All right, so back over on Windows, I'm going to go to Azure, and now I want to deploy my container to Azure. I have it already up, of course, in the Container Registry. So what I want to do is create a new Linux-based app service and deploy it there. So I'm going to search for app service in the search box of the Azure portal. Click on that, hit create, and then pick my subscription, pick the resource group where I want to push it to, and it's going to be RG Munson West US Linux. Give it a name. So I'm going to say, we'll just call it Munson-API Linux West US. And that's a good one. It's going to be a Docker container running on Linux, West US for the region. And then I already have an app service plan created, so pick that for me. And I can now go through and create it. So I'm creating it with just the basic. It comes with a Hello World Docker creator, Docker container for it. So I'm going through and creating that first. Because the reason I'm doing that is because I want to grant this particular app service, create a managed identity for it, and then give that pull permission from my Azure Container Registry. So the deployment's still in process, and this might take a couple minutes to finish up, or it'll finish up right when I say it will. So I'll go to the resource, and the first thing I want to do then is pull up identity from the left-hand side, and then say, I do want to have a managed identity. Enable it, click Save, and this will only take a couple seconds for it to go through. Save it. We'll dismiss it so we can watch it go. And then once it's done, I'll be able to go over to my ACR instance. From there, we want to give access to that managed identity we just created to be able to pull from Azure Container Registry. Select Access Control, and then Add. Pick Role Assignment, and then everything's already sorted by category, and so what I want then is ACR Pull. Click Next, click Manage Identity, and of course, select Members. So it already pulls up the Managed Identity, and I can see I have two app services already there, one from before and then one I just assigned. And the one I want is Munson API Linux West US. Then I'll select it, hit Next, hit Review and Assigned, and it'll actually go through and assign it. And so we have the little green check mark, so we're good to go. The next portion then is to go back to the app service and then tell it which container and which ACR to pull from. So you can do that from Deployment Center. So I'm going to go through, loading the deployments settings, and then I could pick which registry to pull from. So I'm only going to pull a single container. I could do a Docker Compose or a single container. We're just going to do one. And which registry source. So we're going to do Azure Container Registry. And then it's going to pick my subscription ID, and then how to authenticate, which happens to be managed identity, a system assigned one that we're going to use, and then which registry to use, Munson Pickles ACR, and then I'm going to have to type in the image name. And of course, I don't remember that, so I'll open up another instance of the portal to use. And once that comes through, I'll open it up, the container registry, so I can browse down to the repositories, get the Pickles API, copy that in. So this is my image name, Pickles/API. v1 is my tag. I don't need to have a startup file. I'm not going to set up any continuous deployment here. I just want to pull it. Have that set up. I'm going to click Save. And now it's going to save the container configuration. And there's one last step I want to do, and that's to set up the database environment key. So just go down to Configuration Settings, do a new application setting, and I'm going to jump over to my Visual Studio so I can pull that out. It's in my secrets.json. And I'm going to pull connection strings, SQLDB.Azure. Pop that in, and then it complains. But that's because colons are not allowed in connection strings names on Linux. So I just have to replace that with double underscores. And this is a thing on app service. So this isn't overall, because you remember when I was running it back on the Mac, I could leave the colons in here. But for Linux on app service, I have to replace them with double underscore. And then I'm going to put the value in. So I'll go through and select everything there. Get the user ID and then the password. And don't worry, I will be changing all of that before we go live with the video. Paste that in. Hit OK. And then save it. Always remember to save. And then once that's updated, what I'm going to do is stop the web app, restart it to make sure everything is updated and brought in. And then we should be able to browse and see our products being pulled from the database. Everything is stopped. Successfully started. I'm going to browse to the URL that it gives me. And once it loads up, because right now it might be pinging Azure SQL again to restart it, because remember, Azure SQL is serverless, and it gives me a 404. That's because I have nothing set for the base. But if I do products, and here you see I got them returned. Great. So I deployed my container or my image into Azure Container Apps, pulled it down onto Mac, and was able to view it there, totally portable, able then to deploy it into an Azure App Service by granting managed identity access to my app service to the Azure Container Registry and pull it into there. Now you might be wondering, how was I able to pull it without doing any managed identity granting? That's because my user account on the Mac side, who I logged into Azure CLI was, I'm the administrator, so I kind of get it magically and by default. So that's how just that the ACR login, that just worked for me. All right, this is what we did. We took our code, put it in a container registry, and then we pushed it over into app service. And we could do it with more than one app service just fine. Containerization then. We covered what the benefits of containerization was, and we actually saw that in the demo a bit, and how we can port between environments. Everything is isolated from the operating system. It's really a great way to develop applications. And we saw some of the advantages of using it in the cloud as well. And the thing that I really like best is that it enables us to do a microservice architecture fairly easily. And then we saw some of the Azure services, specifically Azure Container Registry and App Service, have that all up and running. So that was containerizing .NET applications so we could deploy it up into Azure. So my name is Matt Sokup, and I hope you join me on the next journey of the Beginner series, where we start talking about serverless and Azure functions.